Hi everyone, good afternoon. Thanks for all of you that are here so far. I'm just going to give everyone else a couple of minutes and then we'll kick off. I can see the numbers ticking up rapidly. For those of you that have just joined, welcome. I'm just giving everyone a couple more minutes and then we're going to kick off. I think the flurry of joiners has slowed down a little bit, so I'm going to give 30 more seconds and then kick off. I jinxed it because as soon as I said that, there was another flurry. Okay, great. I'm going to get started then. So good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining and welcome to Eunomia's webinar on Scope 3 emission reporting in the public sector. I'll start by introducing Eunomia and our webinar series. So Eunomia is an international independent environmental consultancy. We've got expertise across the circular, natural and carbon economies. And across these themes, we provide really data-driven and evidence-based research and consultancy to our clients across the public, private and NGO sectors. We've got over 23 years of experience and over 150 employees across offices in the UK, Brussels, New York and Auckland. We're a really value-driven business providing independent, respected and impact-driven advice. And today's webinar is part of our Fit for the Future webinar series. We're running that throughout 2025 to help our clients stay aware of upcoming sustainability legislation and also best practice advice. Finally, to introduce myself so you know who is speaking to you for the next 30 minutes or so, I'm Charlie Leaman-Pearce. I'm a principal consultant at Eunomia and our low carbon economy lead. I've got over 6 years experience in advising clients in greenhouse gas accounting, ambition setting and also decarbonisation strategy and action plan development. I'm also joined here today by a few colleagues, but most important to introduce is Alex Forrest, who's a managing consultant at Eunomia with over 20 years experience in advising clients in net zero strategy, sustainable procurement, and also circular economy strategy. Before I dive in, a little bit about webinar etiquette. Before we begin, your microphone should be turned off, but you'll notice videos are on. It's much nicer to be presenting to your faces or your little bubbles than just talking to myself. The chat function is disabled, but please do feel free to drop questions into the Q&A function and we'll aim to address these at the end. We've got about 30 minutes of main content for the webinar, and then hopefully we'll have 10-15 minutes to get to some of those questions at the end. So let's get started. This webinar is aiming to cover a few things focusing around Scope 3. So firstly, why Scope 3 matters, what carbon accounting and Scope 3 emissions are, what the Greenhouse Gas Protocol is and how it works in the context of Scope 3 and the public sector, how public sector organisations in particular can understand and tackle Scope 3 emissions, how to design action plans to deliver on your Scope 3 ambitions and targets, what opportunities and barriers there are to tackling Scope 3 and how to harness and overcome these. And also, if you're interested in finding out more or gaining support, who to speak to within Eunomia for that support. So why does scope 3 matter? Well, I'm sure lots of you know that human activities have raised the atmosphere's carbon dioxide content. They've actually raised it by 50% in less than 200 years. And the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere is currently 427 parts per million as of June last year, which was a record high. And this is off track, unfortunately, with the trajectory needed to stay within the science-based 1.5 degrees C warming limit. And interestingly, for millennia, the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere didn't go beyond 300 parts per million. So this jump up to over 400 is a lot. And as you can imagine, this has severe impacts on our climate. Now, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has stated that limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees C instead of 2 degrees could result in far less extreme climate impacts and reduce the pressure on our resilience. So, for example, limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees C instead of 2 could result in around 420 million fewer people being frequently exposed to extreme heat waves. And the IPCC's 2018 report demonstrated that emissions need to be net zero by 2050 and down by about half, 45% by 2030 to stay at or below that 1.5 degrees C temperature rise. Whereas for limiting warming to 2 degrees C, emissions are projected to need to decline by about a quarter, so 25% by 2030, and then reach net zero by about 2070. So the cumulative emissions until the time of reaching net zero and the level of greenhouse gas emission reductions this decade will therefore largely determine whether we can limit that warming to 1.5 or 2 degrees C and limit the worst impacts of climate change. So what happens in the next 5 years is really important. So how does scope 3 fit into that? Well, scope 3 emissions, which stem from the supply chain and other indirect sources, can represent a really significant portion of an organisation's environmental impact. So accurate reporting of these emissions is really essential to realise local climate commitments alongside organisational net zero goals. However, according to the 2024 Local Government Association Climate Change Survey, while over 90% of local authorities report on Scope 1 and 2 emissions, only about 2/3 are including some elements of Scope 3 in those reports. So with only 5 years left for those that have committed to net zero 2030 targets and to make strides to stay within that 1.5 degrees C warming limit, time is really running out to measure and reduce Scope 3 emissions. Now, Scope 3 emissions is usually the largest category of emissions for an organisation, about 60 to 95%, and are equally the most difficult and complex to measure. In England, there's currently no central government guidance or mandated measurement and reporting framework for public sector Scope 3 emissions. And Scope 3 emission measurement methods are also relatively new, with many supporting and private sector tools and toolkits with varying degrees of comparability. Because of that, it is quite challenging to navigate the different options available and to establish reliability and consistency. So it's really important to remember that the purpose of your reporting is to help develop and support change. So it's important to be proportionate and think about how reporting will achieve this for your organisation. Now, the World Economic Forum reports that the path to net zero cannot be achieved without step-changing Scope 3 emission reductions. Organisations really need to understand their suppliers, hold them to account, and make sure to identify the challenges that they have. Now, what this slide is showing is a North England Combined Authorities footprint, which we produced recently in our Scope 3 project work for them. And here it's highlighting how significant procurement and investment emissions were. Procurement hotspot in particular is very typical for a local authority and other public sector organisations, but investment slightly less so. On procurement, local authorities in England spend typically over £50 billion with external suppliers. The NHS spends around £70 billion on procurement, and that equates to a top area of spend after staff costs and primary care spending. And UK higher education institutions spend around £10 billion per year on goods, works and services. For local authorities at least, half of this is often on high carbon procurement like buildings and highways. So used well, procurement and commissioning could supercharge how local government and the wider public sector drives the net zero agenda. There are challenges, of course. Years of austerity have created bottom line first culture. There's no standard methodology for carbon handling and procurement. Social value approaches are quite often too broad and can ignore emissions. Local is sometimes used as a proxy for sustainable when it comes to procurement. Greenwashing from suppliers is increasingly rife. And alongside all of this, there's typically a lack of technical knowledge and capacity among already busy procurement staff. Measuring Scope 3 emissions does have several benefits though. So for most businesses and public bodies, the majority of their greenhouse gas emissions and cost reduction opportunities are outside their own operations. So addressing Scope 3 emissions can help advance an organisation's decarbonisation and sustainability journey. By measuring Scope 3 emissions, in particular those across the supply chain, public sector bodies can prioritise decarbonisation efforts and identify where they can make the biggest difference, collaborate with suppliers to reduce emissions, and really demonstrate community level benefits of supply chain decarbonisation. It can help leverage significant buying power to act as a catalyst and drive change. Also encourage employees to reduce emissions from business travel, commuting, waste and water, which spreads out into their everyday life and activities. It can help communicate a comprehensive footprint and progress with stakeholders like constituents and communities. And obviously it can also help to contribute national efforts towards achieving net zero. So understanding the scale of a challenge with regards to Scope 3 is therefore a really important first step. So I'm going to speak now about carbon accounting for the public sector in particular. A little bit of background for those of you that are a bit less familiar with carbon accounting and Scope 3 first. So what is carbon accounting? Well, carbon accounting or greenhouse gas accounting is a framework of methods to measure and track how much greenhouse gas an organisation emits. Organisations use a variety of methods to track and report greenhouse gas emissions. So these can include the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, Task Force on Climate-related Financial Disclosure, Global Reporting Initiatives, and various others. But the Greenhouse Gas Protocol is a group of standards that is typically the most common in greenhouse gas accounting. And through that protocol, emissions and removals are categorised according to whether they fall within scopes 1, 2, and 3. And this slide is showing those three scopes and how they relate to each other. And the purpose of that categorisation into scopes is to indicate how much influence the organisation can have over those different types of emissions. This slide is just showing Scope 3 in a bit more detail. So this covers all other indirect emissions not already covered by Scope 2 and is split into 15 distinct reporting categories, as you can see on the slide, and it's often reported as both upstream and downstream Scope 3 sources. Aside from giving you a better oversight of how your organisation's activities are producing emissions and thereby enabling you to strategically plan to reduce them, there are reasons why you might be required to calculate and report your greenhouse gas emissions, or at least require your suppliers to do so. So for example, if you fall under the PPN 0621 or perhaps the NHS supplier requirements or even SECA policy. You might also opt to adhere to principles of voluntary standards, which require you to calculate and report your greenhouse gas emissions. So things like the ISO standards or the Science Based Target Initiative or even TCFD. Now, as you're probably getting a clue about, most reporting standards and target setting frameworks are set up for corporates and don't cover public sector organisations, although as I've said, many are applying the principles to their greenhouse gas accounting and target setting approaches. So for instance, many public sector are following the principles of setting targets aligned with SBTi. However, there are more standards emerging which include public sector organisations. So there's the BSI Net Zero Pathway Standard and also the University and Colleges Race to Zero campaign. So if you'd like to learn more about these requirements, please do get in touch. Now, a step that is sometimes skipped in greenhouse gas accounting is boundary setting. So it's really important to set a really clear boundary before diving into the Scope 3 footprinting process. So during boundary setting, the organisational and operational boundary are set. Now the organisational boundary refers to all the entities that are within the remit of your footprint. So for some of you, this will be the organisation itself, but if you have an operational control or perhaps a majority financial stake in another company, this may also fall under your organisational boundary. And to decide on your organisational boundary, you need to decide if you're going to do it based on your control over the organisation, so that can be operational control or financial control, or whether you're going to account for emissions based on your equity share in that organisation. Once you've set that organisational boundary, then you move on to the operational boundary, and that is then all the emission sources relevant to those organisations using the 3 scopes that we discussed earlier. Now, boundary setting is typically an area most public sector organisations do require some support on, as I've said, the Greenhouse Gas Protocol and other reporting guidance doesn't account for the complexities and service-led model of public sector organisations. And in our experience, when it comes to Scope 3, boundary setting is a particular area of importance that we've supported organisations to unpick. Quite often it's the case that you would have done your Scope 1 and 2 footprint, and perhaps the boundary setting process has been maybe skipped over. It's much simpler to do your Scope 1 and 2 footprint. You can just think about the buildings and vehicles that you operate in or that you own. Whereas when it comes to Scope 3, that boundary setting exercise becomes really important, and it's something that public sectors need to unpick really clearly and carefully before undertaking that Scope 3 footprint. Now, moving on to data, there is obviously a lot of data required to be able to calculate emissions from each Scope 3 greenhouse gas source, and the more granular the data, the more accurate the calculation of emissions will be. However, it is very much acknowledged that availability of data will be limited by what is already collected by your team, so for instance your finance team, and what is also able to be provided by suppliers. If that optimal data isn't available, other primary data can still be used, and any data gaps remaining can be addressed with reputable third-party data sets or assumptions. So for instance, if the mass of your operational waste and treatment isn't known, but the floor area is known, then industry average data can be used based on floor area to estimate the waste-related emissions for your organisation. So as I've already alluded to, not just the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, but all greenhouse gas accounting systems have limitations for use by the public sector and other large stakeholders and service providers. Public sector is obviously quite an unusual type of organisation. Now, corporate greenhouse gas accounting assumes that you make paper or you provide consulting advice. It doesn't account for an organisation having statutory obligations to deliver certain services, some of which, like waste, could be delivered internally or contracted out. So local authorities and other larger stakeholders or service providers, like NHS trusts, can therefore end up in quite complicated allocation scenarios. Likewise, a Greenhouse Gas Protocol doesn't account for the complex responsibilities and therefore control and influence over certain aspects of operations between different tiers of authorities. So if you felt or you feel in the future that greenhouse gas accounting doesn't quite make sense for you as an organisation, then it's really important to understand that this is likely the nature of the corporate accounting system you're trying to adhere to, and that you're not doing something incorrectly, and you're just trying to fit your organisation type into a box not designed for the public sector. So it's really important to interpret the Greenhouse Gas Protocol or other corporate accounting system as accurately and appropriately as you can to make sure you align with best practice. But it's also really important to be transparent with the greenhouse gas accounting approach you've taken, especially with regards to that boundary setting and then communicating that clearly with all stakeholders. It's also really important to bear this context in mind when you're comparing your greenhouse gas analysis or decarbonisation progress with other public sector or unique organisation types, because their interpretation of the Greenhouse Gas Protocol might be different, and therefore it's really important to explore and understand this before you draw comparisons. Now, I'm sure lots of you have potentially seen this diagram before, but I just wanted to share it as an example of public sector, in this case NHS England, that has interpreted the greenhouse gas protocol and drawn their own boundary and footprint that best represents their needs. So NHS England has what they call NHS carbon footprint, which includes scopes 1 and 2 and a subset of scope 3. And then they also have their Footprint Plus, which includes other elements of Scope 3, and then even some emission sources like patient and visitor travel, which is outside the greenhouse gas protocol. And they have different targets and ambitions for those two different footprints. So this is an example of building on the principles of the greenhouse gas protocol and using that for your context. One last slide before we talk about tackling Scope 3 is an important factor to consider about the greenhouse gas protocol and other greenhouse gas accounting systems with regards to waste-related emissions. So if a local authority is responsible for the collection and or treatment of waste, then the emissions resulting from the collection or treatment of that waste will typically be accounted for within your operational footprint if you're strictly following the greenhouse gas protocol. So if a local authority aims to increase recycling, then this may require more collection and more treatment, which ultimately will result in higher operational emissions according to the greenhouse gas protocol. However, in reality, this process is likely to be reducing emissions overall in the system, as recycling driving up recycling, means less virgin materials are needed in the supply chain. So this is reducing emissions from minimal material extraction and processing, and that doesn't typically occur in the UK anymore, but it's happening elsewhere. So it's really important to recognise this when reporting progress against your greenhouse gas footprint and flag this as a shortcoming of the greenhouse gas protocol. In short, recycling produces emissions, but you're saving emissions elsewhere that are not accounted for under the greenhouse gas protocol. So you could estimate these and report them separately, or you could even choose to deviate from the greenhouse gas protocol. More than this, if a local authority contracts out their waste service, this could be accounted for within Scope 3. However, if you move that waste service in-house, these emissions would be accounted for under Scope 1 or Scope 2 if you're lucky enough to have electric waste collection vehicles. So if you as a local authority have different targets for direct versus indirect emissions, this can cause complications when reporting progress against targets. So again, it's really important to be transparent and communicate these nuances. And this situation could apply to any organisations moving any service from in-house to outsourced or vice versa. Now, there is reporting guidance for local authorities available on the Local Government Association website. And obviously a similar set of circumstances can apply for other public sector or similar type of organisations. And there is also reporting guidance for higher education institutions via the EAUC Standardised Carbon Emissions Framework. So there is more bespoke help out there. So just to finish up with some recommendations around tackling Scope 3 emissions, this slide just shows the 12 steps that we typically guide the organisations that we work with through to build a really detailed and actionable decarbonisation strategy. I've spoken a little bit about deciding on scope and understanding the scale of the challenge, and obviously the next step is typically deciding on your aim or target. I'm not going to go into that today, but if you're keen to hear more, please do reach out. What I am going to speak about is identifying those areas of focus, identifying interventions, and some of the building blocks of creating an action plan. So first up is the spend prioritisation tool. So this was initially developed by, for the UK Sustainable Procurement Task Force and published in Procuring the Future, with DEVRA adapting it as part of the National Sustainable Public Procurement Programme. We've since adapted it in-house here at Eunomia and use it to help organisations identify categories of spend to prioritise for emission reduction action. So the assessment is done by assigning a score of 0 to 3 for each different procurement category to indicate the applicability of various criteria. So I'll give you an example. And one question that we might ask of a spend category is, do the goods or services rely on significant energy input for manufacture, supply or use? So for professional services, this would be scored a 0, indicating that it doesn't require significant energy input, while catering would score a 3, indicating that it does. And each question is part of one of 3 sets for which the overall score is used to then quantify an area of spend to prioritise for emission reduction action. So questions are typically grouped into opportunity, so the current extent to which it's technically possible for an organisation to reduce the emissions impact of that spend group. Influence, a measure of the ability to influence suppliers and successfully request changes that lead to lower carbon procurements. And then lastly, risk. So that's a measure of the environmental impact of that spend group and therefore the risk to you as an organisation and your decarbonisation targets if action isn't taken. So obviously a higher risk score there represents higher negative environmental impacts. So this allows procurement spend categories to be prioritised for focused action. As I mentioned before, procurement is often the largest proportion of your Scope 3 footprint, so this helps you to take a tailored and focused approach to emission reduction. Another method of prioritisation for Scope 3 action used can be a multi-criteria analysis approach. So we've used this method to help organisations like the University of Cambridge to identify Scope 3 categories to prioritise for decarbonisation action, and particularly in the near term. So this can be used across all Scope 3 categories, not just procurement. So as you can see on the slide, there's 8 different criteria, and you ultimately take a similar approach to the spend prioritisation tool where you score each Scope 3 category against these different criteria to end up with a list of prioritisations. Now, each category has a different weighting, and that's the number in the square brackets. So you can see that magnitude, so size of emissions from that Scope 3 category has a higher weighting, but we are still taking into account different areas. So visibility of action against that Scope 3 category, building on existing action, the risk of not acting against that Scope 3 category, and all sorts of things. So the main benefit being that you're not just prioritising action on the amount of emissions that that Scope 3 category is creating, but you're also taking into account a lot of other factors. Now, as I've mentioned quite a few times now, procurement is typically a large part of the challenge when it comes to Scope 3. So I thought I would just speak through kind of the sustainable procurement hierarchy and some kind of key things to think about when it comes to reducing emissions from that area. So low carbon circular procurement really represents a strategic approach to sustainable procurement, and it's all about asking the right questions early enough and asking them with the right people. So you really want to start off with the concept of reducing. So rethinking the need of what you're buying, thinking about redeploying, sharing, repairing what you already have first. Then you want to be looking at reuse and resourcing. So buying used, refurbished or remanufactured products where you can, rethinking how you procure and thinking about extending product lifetimes through things like leasing, maintenance or service contracts. If you've thought about reducing, so rethinking the need or buying reused, and then you determine that you do still need to buy new, then buying sustainable products where you can is the next step. So thinking about products that are designed for end of life, ones that are low carbon or have high recycled content. And then lastly, you want to be thinking about recovery of those materials. So making sure to think about negotiating end of life options with your suppliers and contractors. Now, before I wrap up, I just wanted to include a few other top tips. I'm going to focus on procurement and waste, but just 1 or 2 on buildings and transport first. Obviously, there are other aspects of Scope 3 that very much do need to be thought about. It's not just procurement, although that is the largest part of the challenge typically. But on emissions from buildings within your Scope 3, so this could be your downstream leased assets, so buildings that you own and lease out, and even like the waste generated from your operations. This is often a smaller element of your Scope 3, but could provide really good quick wins, particularly if you've already mobilised change and action with regards to your Scopes 1 and 2. A lot of those actions can be built off of to address your Scope 3 buildings and energy emissions. Then we've got travel. So depending what exact sector you're sitting in, this could end it, particularly if you're a university, that could be a large part of your Scope 3 footprint. So identifying what journey types are resulting in the most emissions is a really important first step, as well as thinking about which journeys are unnecessary, particularly if they are ones that are coinciding with being high emitting. And then lastly, on procurement and waste, I'm just going to go into a bit more detail about how you can embed low carbon circular economy principles. So the life cycle impacts of goods and services is really important to consider environmental impacts throughout their entire life cycle. So from production to use to disposal. So by considering those whole life impacts of a product, asset, infrastructure, or even service, this provides you with a better understanding of the total implications of your purchase decisions, including the environmental cost and impacts associated with resource extraction, use, energy consumption, maintenance, and disposal. So I'm going to use an example of a laptop. So the average carbon footprint of a laptop contributes about 331 kilograms of CO2 equivalent during production alone. So you want to be looking to source products with type 1 eco-label criteria for design, production, energy use. You want to be thinking about rent or lease equipment, including managed services, so product as a service. And you want to be thinking about extending product life, so including upgrading of components rather than replacement where you can. Now, pre-procurement is a critical stage to ensure the right decisions are made early enough that supports low carbon outcomes. So consideration of opportunities that support low carbon and circular outcomes obviously can be challenging, as it's got to include rethinking the need for procurement and a shift to a focus on required functionality. So it's really important that all relevant stakeholders are involved in the consideration of how to achieve those relevant outcomes. So this could include executives, senior responsible officers, finance, budget holders, end users, all the way to waste and sustainability managers. So for example, using our laptop example again, a pre-procurement action checklist for that could be asking questions like, are sustainability objectives clearly defined for the planned procurement? Have all relevant life cycle impacts of ICT been considered in the evaluation process? And things like that. And by communicating with suppliers early, particularly at that pre-procurement stage, this offers you the opportunity to help inform suppliers of your objectives and potential requirements linked to future contracts, so specific requirements for carbon reduction. So I just want to wrap up with a few key takeaways and some ideas of what your next steps might be as an organisation. So the 4 key takeaways I'd love you to take away is what we do in the next 5 years largely determines whether we can stay within that 1.5 degrees C warming limit and avoid the most extreme impacts of climate change. Scope 3 is usually the largest proportion of an organisation's carbon footprint, and conducting a Scope 3 footprint can help you prioritise areas for action, collaborate with suppliers and leverage buying power. And lastly, used well, procurement could supercharge how the public sector drives the net zero agenda. So if you're starting on this journey, I'd really encourage you to draw your Scope 3 boundary and identify some data owners to start developing your Scope 3 footprint. If you've already got a Scope 3 baseline, you're a little bit further along in the journey, I'd suggest identifying areas of focus and prioritising those to create a really focused Scope 3 action plan. We can very much help you with all of this, so I'd love to hear from you if you're interested. Areas that we can help with in particular is setting that more complicated greenhouse gas boundary, helping you measure your Scope 3 footprint, including setting appropriate targets, and ultimately building a decarbonisation action plan. So yeah, before we move on to questions, you can get a bit more information about us or request a call back through these QR codes, or if you'd like to speak to Alex or I directly, please just feel free to email us. But yeah, thank you very much for coming. Let's see what questions we've had come in.
Thanks, Charlie.
Oh, hi, Alex.
Hi, Charlie. So I'm just looking through the questions. We have one here around, this probably looks more like a question for me around procurement. So what do you think the biggest barrier that public sector organisations are currently facing in decarbonising their procurement emissions? So I think, Charlie, you've already touched on some of those key challenges. Perhaps it's just worth sort of reiterating, in my view, what I consider to be those challenges. So making decisions early on the procurement cycle and shifting from business as usual. I think the fact that procurement actually happens via budget holders and commissioning teams often, so procurement is is actually a function of how tenders and contracts are let, not exclusively, but I think that's one of the key challenges where decisions around what to buy, where to buy, how to buy, and rethinking that purchasing strategy typically needs to sort of happen very much earlier in the process. And it's about bringing all those stakeholders together. Delivering on low carbon can't just be a function of procurement teams. There's a whole range of stakeholders are involved in deciding what to buy and how to buy. So I think that's one of the key challenges, overlaying understanding what good actually looks like in the context of low carbon procurement. So really understanding, as you've alluded to in your slides, Charlie, what are the life cycle impacts that we're seeking to manage, and how do we do that through the context of a procurement exercise, but also routes to procurement. So we know that public sector use public sector frameworks to call off goods, services, and works. Are they aligned to net zero? Do they offer low carbon goods and services? We're doing a lot of work actually in that space. Historically, we've done a lot of work to help framework managers align their frameworks in response to net zero and circular economy asks. And there's a lot of guidance actually out there, some of which we've developed. So we've developed low carbon procurement guides for public sector. So it's worth having a look on our website for links. In fact, I'll put a couple of links in the chat afterwards, just sort of point you in the direction around, guidance for low carbon procurement. We have another question here around SBTI. So I've heard a lot about SBTI. Are there any updates in regards to the standard? Or is that changing? Is that one that you could comment on, Charlie?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Alex. So as I've kind of alluded to, SBTI isn't directly applicable for public sector organisations, so you can't formally be verified and set targets under that standard. But lots of public sector organisations are using its principles to set SBTI aligned targets. So the thing to be aware of when it comes to Scope 3 is that SBTI is currently has an ongoing public consultation around revising the boundaries and guidance for setting Scope 3 emissions. So that's something to kind of keep an eye on. And even if you wanted to contribute to that public consultation, please feel free to do so. The biggest changes that might happen, for those of you that are aware of SBTI already and Scope 3 setting, there is optional and mandatory inclusions, and also for near-term targets at least, it's only a certain percentage of your Scope 3 emissions that you have to include within that near-term target. And that is the thing that's currently under consultation that may change. So even if you're just using SBTI to guide your target setting process, it's still worth keeping an eye on what the outcomes of that consultation are.
Thanks, Charlie. There's a question here around investments. So one of your previous slides obviously covered the significant chunk that investments can make within a Scope 3 footprint overall. Could you sort of allude to what's typically included within the investments footprint?
Yeah, so under the greenhouse gas protocol, there's kind of three types of investments that are mandatory to include. So equity investments, so any equity investments made by you using the company, or in your case, like organizations, own capital and balance sheet. Then you've also got debt investments, and then project finance. So any kind of long-term financing of projects by you as an organisation as either an equity investor or debt investor. Now, a lot of those circumstances get quite complicated when we look at public sector investing, and that case that I showed, it was quite unusual that investments was such a large proportion. Pensions was included, which is an optional inclusion under the greenhouse gas protocol. So I wouldn't say that's a typical case for a local authority, but it can happen in some instances where there are a large amount of investments happening.
Thanks, Charlie. We've got another one here. Where can we find guidelines for GHG accounting for public authorities? And I guess with reference, Charlie, to the fact that you mentioned GHG protocol doesn't strictly align to public sector or organisations, and therefore there's a bit of navigation required through the protocol itself. But are you aware of any guidelines for public authorities in particular?
So, as I mentioned, the local government association has greenhouse gas accounting guidance for local authorities. and there's also guidance for universities. Other than that, I'm not aware of any other standards, hence why we do find a lot of organisations coming to us for support in interpreting the principles of the Greenhouse Gas Protocol or other accounting systems.
Great, thanks, Charlie. Another one here, just picking up on the particular topic of food waste. So the question is reducing food waste an effective means to lower Scope 3 emissions?
So depending on the type of operations that you're undertaking and how much that makes up of your footprint, obviously that is very dependent how then impactful it would be in lowering your Scope 3 footprint. But in general, yes, the emissions from food waste are quite high. So that can be a really effective way to make substantial change. There's obviously wider environmental benefits to looking at reducing your food waste, and also looking at the type of food that you're providing on your menus or catering to your staff and clients. So there's not just carbon, but wider environmental impacts to think about there.
Thank you, Charlie. One question around best practice here, and the question is, do you know of any, it says European cities, but I guess that could be UK cities as well, that can be considered examples of proper calculation and reduction of Scope 3 emissions? Now, obviously, we're aware of the work that we're undertaking for our own clients, and some of those are focused around defined sort of geographic locations in the northwest, for example, where we're undertaking work with municipalities, local authorities, as well as academia, all under one city, if you like. So, but in terms of examples of sort of good practice at a city level, Charlie, are you aware of any?
In Europe more widely, none come to mind, but from a national perspective, Leeds, I would suggest is a good place to look. I don't know if this person is aware or not of the government, and then also the scatter tool, which can give you an area-wide footprint for your city or local authority. So, and there's also tools available down to parish and town level, if you're interested. But yeah, Leeds would be my suggestion nationally.
Great. There's one other question here around data and the type of data required to build up a comprehensive Scope 3 baseline. So the question is around yeah, challenges around where to find the right data, and but also the time it takes in order to gather that data. Can you sort of summarize, based on your experience, Charlie, around what you consider to be some of those key challenges, and sort of discuss the sort of timing impact of that as well, because it does often take a bit of time to get together the right data.
Yeah, I think a lot of it comes down to priorities. So if you are looking for a really comprehensive footprint that gives you a really crystal clear picture on exactly where you should prioritize in terms of your Scope 3 emissions, then ideally you would be looking to collect beyond spend-based data. So beyond, business travel expenses or spend when it comes to your procurement. So that's looking at a much longer lead-in time, and that would be you'd need a really detailed data owner and stakeholder engagement process there to make sure you can get that higher quality data. If getting a more detailed footprint is a priority, what we found is that quite often the hotspots are quite common across organisations of a similar type, and therefore as a first go at doing your Scope 3 footprint and identifying those hotspots, spend data can be enough to give you that initial steer on where you should focus your efforts, particularly if you're then going to use a tool like our spend priorisation tool, or the multi-criteria analysis to dive deeper into where you should focus your decarbonisation efforts. So if you're wanting to get started on action sooner rather than later, then a higher level data approach like spend can be a good first step.
Great. And just one final question on following the science and SBTI. If a public sector organisation wants to follow the science, is there any reason why they can't follow SBTI, the principles?
No, there's no reason why they can't follow the principles. I would encourage them to look at the BSI Net Zero pathway, which has recently been launched, which builds on the principles of the Science Based Target Initiative, but can also apply to public sector. And as I mentioned, there is other initiatives specific to some public sector types. So, for instance, universities and colleges, Race to Net Zero or Race to Zero, sorry, is another one to have a look at. But in the absence of a better option, SBTI is typically a good one to follow the principles of when it comes to target setting.
Great. And I think we're out of time.
Great. Cheers, Alex. Thank you, everyone.